Hello, and welcome to Hay Festival's February Book of the Month. I'm Rebecca Watson. I'm Assistant Arts Editor at the Financial Times and author of Little Scratch. And I'm very delighted to be here tonight to talk with Francis Spufford, who is author of many books, including I May Be Some Time, Read Plenty, his 2016 debut novel Golden Hill, and most recently Like Perpetual. Like Perpetual is an extraordinary, life-giving book that starts with a real event. A German rocket hits a Woolworths in South London in 1944, killing many. Among them are 5 children called Val, Joe, Vernon, Ben, and Alec. And the novel begins with a kind of what if? What if these children had never died? What lives might they have lived? And we follow the 5 of them in close third person, meeting them for a day at 15-year intervals right throughout their lives as they try and find meaning, as they make mistakes, as they suffer from illness, mental and physical, as they recover, as they act for good and for bad. It's a wonderful book, and I'm really looking forward to talking with Francis about it. But before we get stuck in, there's a little bits of housekeeping. If you don't have a copy of Like Perpetual, which you should. They are available for purchase on the Hay Festival website, along, as I've been told to say, with my own novel. You can also buy a copy from your local bookseller. Questions are welcome throughout the session, so please submit them in the questions tab that you should see in front of you. We will do our best to get through as many of them as possible. There really is time for them, so do put through anything that comes to you. And as well, thank you to everyone who has donated to the festival's Future Fund when they registered for this event. It's not an easy time, but if you can, then please do support the festival by donating on the website. And finally, for housekeeping, Hay's Book of the Month for March will be What We Owe Each Other, a New Social Contract. There's a live Q&A on 9th of March and registration is open now. Okay, Francis. So nice to meet you and talk through the screen.
Rebecca, likewise. Meet in quotation marks and all of that. But, you know, if we can do the digital equivalent of telling people where the fire exits are, we can do the digital equivalent of meeting as well. Exactly.
I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you about Like Perpetual, which I genuinely loved and was very moved by. It has a kind of restorative quality. It really reignites or reaffirms empathy, which is a very significant thing for a book to be able to do. I thought maybe I'd begin by letting you kind of describe the book for the audience, for anyone who maybe hasn't read it yet.
Okay. It was inspired by endlessly walking past the site of the Woolworths in New Cross, which was in fact hit by a V2 on a Saturday lunchtime in November 1944, killing 168 people, including, almost most horribly, a lot of children who'd been taken by their mothers because there was a delivery of saucepans that day. And I wanted to do something which made visible how much those children had missed of the rest of the 20th century and all of the changing decades and the changes in London that had happened in that time. It seemed strange to think of them, as it were, locked within the black and white past when coloured, geologically layered London was going on round and about this thing, which is now a branch of Iceland. But I didn't. Like most things in South London, it's interesting but not glamorous, which is kind of what I was hoping for with the book as well. But the real dead belong to real families. There are still relatives of those children out there, and I didn't want to mess around, no matter how empathetically or sensitively with real losses, which some people are still feeling. So I invented 5 completely fictional children and invented, in fact, a completely fictional London borough to put them in, and dropped a V2 on that instead. I've seen some people saying that the opening of the book is misleading because it seems to be about to play high concept metafictional games, because the rocket arrives in extraordinarily slow motion at a 10,000th of a second at a time. And I think some people are then surprised to find that what follows is a seemingly relatively conventional piece of realism, in which, like the Michael Apted Up series, I follow the five of them on jumping a decade and a half and a decade and a half through the phases of life. But the opening is not an accident, and its relationship to the rest of the book is not an accident either. I wanted to do something which took apart, blew apart our familiar sense of time and made us see the strangeness and the precariousness of existing in time at the beginning, taking less than usual for granted about what it's like to be an integral human body with time flowing on around us. And then as the children got to the middle of their lives, you'd kind of forget about it to some extent, the way that we tend to forget about death and our own previous non-existence when we're in the middle. And then it would return. It would be a kind of upside down U-shaped book with a lot of strangeness at the beginning, a lot of apparent ordinariness in the middle, and then a kind of return into the strange at the end.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what you do. And I was going to ask you about this actually, because the profundity comes really from the way that you frame it. Everything is charged with that knowledge, and as you say, you begin with such an awareness of how you've begun, and then you slowly forget until you bring the reader right back to it. And I mean, I wonder whether you ever considered whether that springboard was ever going to not be for the reader, or whether it sounds like maybe that devastation has to be witnessed by the reader, and was that always the case?
I think so. I mean, it was the first bit I wrote. It wasn't an afterthought. I always knew that I wanted the frame of devastation and then life restored looking kind of gratuitous in contrast to it. But although it's not an exact science messing around with what the reader remembers, I did hope for a kind of gentle half-life of forgetting until halfway through their lives it was more or less gone, and you started to think, well, the opening was a bit weird, but this is a very conventional novel, really. And then I would creep up on the reader, grandmother's footsteps style, with further weirdness, until by the end you were back in a place on the edge of the recognizable and facing outwards into kind of darkness, or else light, depending how you look at it.
Yeah. I think even when you're playing with kind of ordinariness, there's a kind of playfulness to it where, as a reader, you're engaging with what you're doing with it. And there's the kind of washing up scene that I didn't know I needed to read, but I did in this book, which is where one of the characters, Alec, who's a newspaper typesetter, there's just this kind of absurdity of movement and of just the sheer practicality and what we do with our bodies when we're trying to wash up, perhaps in Alec's case, not that well. And you bring so much into what should be a scene that isn't at all interesting, but is instead like completely displays what the character is. And these kind of flourishes exist throughout the book. And I mean, it's a bit of a heavy connection to make, but I wonder of how much you thought exploring the everyday is kind of vital for unpacking the human condition. Is it something you're kind of drawn to?
Enormously, because the human condition very straightforwardly happens amidst everyday things. Most fiction is weirdly selective. It's a very fine-grained sieve through which only glamorous and interesting and exceptional things can pass, whereas we spend most of our time not doing that stuff, not having specially important days or specially important conversations, and yet the conversations we do have and the washing up we do constitutes our life. And it seems to me that, looked at closely, none of that stuff is ordinary, except as a kind of slur or a stereotype. There's always things to see in it, and there's also a dignity in just the kind of continued existence that's threaded through it. In Alec's case, yeah, there's a sort of clumsy, well-meaning comedy in it, which lets me do a little special effect kind of show not tell thing about patriarchy, really, because Alec is a nice guy, but he is an old-fashioned unionized breadwinner, and he's at home because he's out on a dispute, and his wife is working, which she's never done before because they are low on money. So he is showing willing by doing the washing up, but there is a skill involved in washing up, a skill that disappears when you're practiced at it, and he isn't, which is why there's too much fairy liquid in his sink, and he ends up covering his hush puppies in foam. And why shouldn't you show that, and why shouldn't it be funny and with a hint of Laurel and Hardy in there, but also why shouldn't character get disclosed in at the sink just as much as during terribly important conversations about adultery and the sunset? It's
yeah, I felt there was kind of a pushback in the novel where the things that perhaps we like to insist aren't kind of literary or aren't how you kind of display a character. You're like, well, actually, I will show you exactly how this is how you kind of probe a character into unveiling who they are.
Yeah.
And it kind of, yeah, I think it pinpoints the way in which I don't know, there's a kind of a physicality, I guess, to the book. And often I think in writing, characters tend to be very ruminative and very in their heads. And I think you really managed to kind of show how someone can be both profound, but also very much in their body.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. I'm not making this stuff up, there are several kind of useful literary traditions here for me to draw on and frankly steal from time to time. I mean, Tolstoy is doing the how shall we describe people reaping a cornfield and show that it's interesting and show that the way that the rhythm of work changes when you get into it. About as classical as you can get in terms of novelistic art. But there's also the kind of the whole massive modernist emphasis on fitting everything in. And if I can kind of break the fourth wall of our conversation a bit here, you've just published a novel which does a modernist close-up day yourself. It's got tube journeys in it. It's got painful and unusual things in it, but it's also just got the kind of, it's got alarm clocks, sorry, very 20th century of me. It's got phone alarms going off. It's got lunch breaks. It's got the rhythm of ordinary time in it. And for you too, that's not a sign of lack of ambition, but on the contrary, of a kind of microscopic looking in and looking harder ambition.
Yeah, well, I think we can. I mean, I think we learn a lot from those modernists in terms of how they do it. Actually, when I was reading like Perpetual, I was really struck by comparisons to the waves. I don't know whether that's something that you would say or not, but I mean, the kind of, obviously there's the obvious comparison of following intertwined lives that start as kids. But there's also the, kind of the heightened ordinariness and kind of giving voice, equal meaning and weight.
All right, embarrassingly, The Waves is one of the Virginia Woolfs I haven't read. Somebody went, you must have been reading The Waves to me in the last couple of weeks, and I've started it, but I haven't got very far, and I haven't got far enough to talk about it coherently. So can I cheat and slide over to Mrs. Dalloway, please, as an example of a day-shaped close-up narrative instead, or Ulysses. It's also exactly one day long. And for that matter, if you're trying to give a sense of whole lives, there is a kind of natural rhyme between the shape of a day and the shape of a life. A day kind of is a natural miniature of a life. It's got absence of self, or at least absence of conscious self at both ends of it. It has a natural rising rhythm into practicality. It discloses individuality as it goes. It has large sort of compulsory bits which you have to do to keep body and soul together. I mean, there's a lot. So it was natural to me to build 5 lives essentially out of 5 days each. I mean, I cheat a bit because sometimes they're sharing a day. The sisters Val and Jo particularly end up sharing pieces of time because they live together, and you can do both viewpoints, one looking one way and then the other looking back. But yeah.
But yeah, there's a real presence of kind of, I guess, units of time, and the ways in which you can kind of take one thing apart and then take the next thing apart. You kind of notice that there's a great, I mean, I'm just now talking about scenes with Alec. They're not all with Alec, but when he's on the tube and suddenly you can't stop noticing that, every person is an individual. We kind of rely on not noticing all the time these various things just to be able to get through the day, get through a moment. But there is just a moment where he's sitting down the tube and he's just overwhelmed with all these different individual people who in themselves have their own individual kind of things to notice. And I felt like a brilliant example of your kind of ambition within this book, looking at the kind of the mechanics of things, that, both the parts of time, the parts of machines, the kind of parts of society. I don't know whether that was kind of a conscious ambition to kind of look at the Russian dolls of any one thing.
Yes, I mean, yes. Greedily, ambitiously, yes. And I wanted both the kind of the necessary kind of leathery, tough surface you present to the world in order to cope with the big city, in which you tune out most of what's going on around you, and also those moments where you go from from being leathery skinned to some sort of very, very permeable membrane, and you see all too much of what's around you. So the bit, and things do happen to the other characters. I feel I must point this out. It isn't all just Alec. Of course, I have had, and I think most people who live in big cities have had, that moment when you suddenly notice that your tube contains several hundred individuals, and it's almost oppressive because they're all as real as you, and they're all busily having days that matter as much to them as yours matters to you, and you want to tune it out again. Once I knew that was going in the book, I went and took notes on a tube platform and waited for doors to open and close, and for people with interesting faces to be there, so I could steal their likenesses and put them in a novel.
They'll never know that they're in there.
Unless they recognise themselves as kind of the man with a strangely Christmas pudding shaped head and all of that, though probably not. But the same thing is going on in Little Scratch when the protagonist sees the man with the weirdly dog-shaped kind of backpack and kind of can't stop noticing him. She follows him up the street, and there are other things going on there, but it's partly just being true to the way that kind of in an urban scene stuffed with multiple things, one thing snags your attention, you hook onto it, and that then becomes the city for a little while.
I guess it's that idea that, we, when we're looking at these 5 portraits of people, it's impossible for each of those people, each person to kind of just stay as themselves. They have to be kind of hooked by whatever's around them. And that really brought in the sense of London in this book, of a kind of sick character that's constantly interrupting or being in conversation with the characters. I thought you did that so brilliantly, and I'd love to talk to you about how you kind of wrestle with this kind of very large and very overbearing character of the city.
In a way, having chosen to do it through 5 microcosms kind of reduces the load to something manageable. It gives you the problem of kind of intensity rather than the problem of trying to fake universal reach. If you're trying to represent the kind of the multiplicity and the continuousness of London through really close attention to a small number of people, you don't have to do the kind of self-conscious crowd scenes. You only have to do the kind of the crowd of impulses inside one skin at a time, which helps.
Sorry, you go.
No, I was just going to witter on about liking cities, really.
Always a valuable thing to talk about. Well, I'm just wondering whether because obviously the borough that it's partly set in is imaginary. South London Borough of Bexford. And I wonder whether you partly chose that as a way of freeing you from some of the kind of non-fiction constraints. I mean, it's such a, I mean, I'd love to hear generally about those kind of different non-fiction, fiction urges and how you kind of wrestle them and keep them together. But I was just really struck by that kind of fictional idea of setting it somewhere that allows you to kind of build more of your own space.
It's very recognisably a kind of hybrid of the South London boroughs I do know and have lived in. But yeah, exactly, with my hands free to kind of mix and match and shift the emphasis where I wanted to. And it's probably true that my kind of long history as a non-fiction writer means that I probably need to kind of to throw the switch marked fiction in some big obvious way that lets me know that I'm allowed to make things up. I remember that my first experiences of fiction, and I crept up to it through a kind of semi-fiction, I've constantly felt this, that I was engaged in some terrible, illegitimate, presumptuous activity, and I ought to check this stuff that I was making up against something. I ought to be able to go and verify the words I had just put in an imaginary person's mouth, and then had to keep reminding myself that, you know, no, there is absolutely nothing to check this against except my own sense of probability and of sort of metaphorical truth. So that's probably why my first novel, that was definitely a novel, was a kind of period romance with wildly elaborate language and kind of the trappings of really blatant invention in it, so that I could tell myself that I was throwing some 18th century filigree switch, and what lay on the other side was definitely invented stuff, rather than me having to be responsible to the literal history of New York, though I kind of was slightly on the quiet. And in the same way, inventing the whole borough, and then being able to kind of creep back from assured falsity to bits of the truth that I wanted in there, to bits of documentary truth. That was an easier way round to do it.
Do you kind of see it as the space between fiction and non-fiction as relatively fluid? Is it kind of a scale where you find yourself sliding between the two, or do they feel like very different headspaces and ways of? They
overlap for me, partly because my non-fiction was always extremely narratively shaped. So in some ways, the kind of curiosity, the documentary curiosity about the world, was always in terms of the stories I could dig out of it where I was concerned. So the fictional equivalent is a very close cousin, but I, again, looked at very close up, it may be more mosaic than kind of truly fluid swirl. I do tend to know which bits are invented and which aren't, and there is still a kind of quietly meticulous or pedantic part of me going, well, you made that bit up, so in the next sentence you better make damn sure that those are the kind of the brown Edwardian tiles that a pub really does have on it somewhere that you've seen, you know.
And with writing like Perpetual, did you still kind of do a decent amount of kind of research into those shifting periods of time before you started writing, or was it kind of as you wrote?
I positively like the process of kind of foraging around through factual stuff in order to find the kind of the little signals that tell you that there's narrative sense to be made, invented as well as non-fictional. So I read my way happily through sort of social histories of the 40s and 50s and 60s. From 1979 onwards, I was kind of there in London for each of the years, though seeing events from very, very different angles from the ones my characters are on. I'm one of the posh boys smoking a silk cut on Ben the bus conductor's bus in 1979. With my tiny sort of Hitchcock-like appearance in my own narrative. They're obviously complete pains, those kids, but and the nearer in time it gets, the more I could kind of work on memory as the thing that gives me London texture.
Yeah.
Do you know exactly where in Little Scratch the overground train sets off from?
I do.
Yeah, I thought you might.
It sets off from White Hart Lane.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yes, makes perfect sense. We might have to explain it to other people slightly, though. Why was it useful to being painstakingly and sometimes painfully true to a fictional person for you to know where the real train she was on went? Why does it help?
Because you want, in order to be able to get those kind of specific everyday qualities that seem kind of universal, you have to know exactly where they've stepped. And so I needed to know, that kind of fabric in order to be able to write things that seem like, oh, she could have made that up, or that could have been anywhere. But those what seem kind of mundane or inconsequential, those kind of details, actually, you kind of feel like you're picking up a certain part of London depending on how much you plan it. Otherwise, you'd find yourself being too broad, too general, because you'd be kind of hedging it a bit. You'd be kind of coming up with a kind of everyman London, which isn't how it works. Yeah.
Which is true to nobody in particular, and therefore really true to nobody at all in some ways. There's a kind of discipline of paying attention to small bits of reality, which at least it feels as if it also works as a kind of discipline of paying attention even to keeping the things you've made up true.
I was wondering about this with your writing, actually, because it's a kind of different, it's an integrity, and I think whether you're writing fiction or non-fiction, you're paying attention to some kind of integrity, whether it's your kind of characters like realness to you, like their fictional integrity, or kind of non-fictional integrity, i.e. historic integrity. Either way, you're trying to, if you don't believe it yourself, then your readers aren't going to.
Yeah, it's disbelief is infectious
exactly.
after all, and cynicism is infectious too. You can't not believe wholeheartedly in the thing you're claiming happened, even though really.
It didn't, but don't tell anyone.
Yeah.
I think I've probably got one more question, and then I think we're going to go to some audience questions. So I think I will ask you. So there's an even-handedness to like Perpetual. I guess in terms, we obviously follow Val, who's complicit in neo-Nazi activity that does not end well. There's Vernon, the kind of
unlike the neo-Nazi activity, which comes out really well in other,
Yeah, some people smash it.
Yeah.
There's the kind of schoolboy turned swindler in Vernon. Although I think Vernon was kind of one of the most heartbreaking threads for me. His kind of constant absence of love, both in not being loved and also not knowing how to love other people, and how that plays out, particularly as he ages, is really heartbreaking. And I wondered, both how you decided the sort of lives you wanted to tell, but also whether it would be fair to say that ideas of redemption and empathy are important to you in your writing.
Extremely important, but in a way, I think this follows on from what we were just talking about. That part of the kind of the discipline of attention is to do with respecting the kind of integral otherness of people who aren't you, and that inventing characters seems to me to be a process of getting yourself to believe really deep down that there are people who aren't you and don't want the same things as you and aren't wired the same way as you, and whose kind of internal weather may be quite different in feeling from what you've known and find familiar, and that empathy is the only appropriate tool to feel your way into these other selves. And I suppose I have an old-fashioned sense that that fiction is powerful because it does other people, and and that it ought to be able to pay. There's George Eliot hovering on one of my shoulders here, probably on the good side, I think, whichever that is. There's a kind of Middlemarch ambition here that you ought to be able to understand what it's like being anybody. Of course, there are practical limits. Nobody's sympathy is universal, but that you ought to be able to feel your way patiently and slowly, and at least when you're writing a book, you get to have, you can spend months deciding what one of somebody's minutes is going to be like. Slowly inside people quite different from you, and you don't have to like them. In fact, you don't have to like them. You don't have to approve of them. You don't have to want to be them. You don't have to think their choices are a good idea. But you do kind of have to love them in an impersonal sort of way.
Yeah. Did you find yourself kind of testing that boundary of giving people characteristics that you're trying to make them as dissimilar to you as possible, or trying different things?
Well, of course, quite a lot of those people are like me, except for the neo-Nazi bit, which I want to underline right now, because you use human beings contain multitudes anyway. So my experience is that your toolkit as a writer is the discordant mixture of things you are, and then you can kind of elaborate on those as a way of into other people. But yeah, I was looking for things that my life very definitely didn't include, and that and would make quite different stories than the one I would tell of myself, or ones I would tell of myself, depending on mood.
Good answer. We've got some great questions from the audience, so I'm going to go right in. Okay. Laura says, can you talk about writing Vern? He's so horrible. And I wouldn't say I sympathise with him, but you make him so human.
Good. He is my mother-in-law's favourite character, which I find satisfying and faintly disturbing as well. And she enjoys his unrepentant grossness, and she is a soprano, so she enjoys his helplessness in the face of music. He is somebody who Rebecca was right a minute ago, Laura. He is somebody who doesn't get to learn how to love, and there is something kind of tragically awful there. But there's also a kind of he can't look away from music, and opera is continually broadcasting him a series of messages that he can't quite let himself believe, but he also can't stop listening to them. He's awful. He does terrible things, but he does them with a kind of gusto, which I hope that you feel reading, you're kind of carried along with. So you almost want him to successfully. Can I give that? Dear, spoilers, block your ears if you haven't read it. You almost want him to successfully rip off that poor footballer, because he's inventing himself. It's a piece of chutzpah. It's a piece of pizzazz conjured out of nowhere. It's a very small budget, creating the impression of a big effect, and you kind of have to admire it, I hope, even if you really disapprove of it.
Yeah, I think.
But not the neo-Nazi stuff. You're not supposed to admire or enjoy that.
Important to keep doing those disclaimers, just for anyone listening. Well, we've got a kind of counter question here from Liz, who says, which of the 5 characters were you fondest of, or are you fondest of? I feel
now like a parent who's been put on the spot slightly. I mean, all my ducklings are swans, and they're all my favourite. But having said that, it was most fun being inside Joe's head. I really enjoyed writing Joe, and writing Ben was hellish until he's happy, when it was joyful writing him, and writing Val was hellish in a different way, and if I successfully kind of invoked her complicity in some of the awful things that happen, it's because I managed to make myself feel quite complicit while I was doing it. You can't stay at a distance. You can't be analytical if you've got your hands in that stuff, which is probably why I'm humorously waving my arms about not being a Nazi. So.
It's interesting. This reminds me of a question I was going to ask you about Jo generally, in that I wondered whether you kind of shared her love of music, because the book has such a musicality that it really felt like that came from the writer.
Let the record show that the kind of witness screwed his fists into his eyes and went, honestly, no. Jo is a lot more musical than me. That was an exercise in the otherness of an invented person. I can't play a musical instrument. My in-laws are all intensely musical. I live in a house with music going on in it. I'm fascinated by other people's relationship to it, but that's not me.
But there's a kind of in the book, it's not just say a talent of playing an instrument, but kind of you hear the sounds of the machines, you hear the kind of refrains of thoughts. There's a kind of a more, I guess, tangible musicality that exists separate from just music.
Oh, that stuff. Yeah, I mean the sense of that you kind of you receive the world rhythmically, and part of what you're hearing is endless layered kind of rhythm lines, which every now and again cohere into a piece of kind of recognizable sort of urban funk or something. Yes, that yes, but not the being able to make the stuff. It's me creeping up and taking months to render a minute when I do musical things. I hope it feels real. I have had actually musical people kind of read it over and go, yes, but no, with various bits of it. So yeah,
it feels real to me. Although I'm not a musician.
Can you play a musical instrument?
Let's say yes, if that makes you feel
absolutely.
Good.
No one will check. So
yeah. We've got a question from Joz. Your novels follow a belief I have that life is lived in the small moments and not the big ones. You seem to cram your novels with small day-to-day details, even in the midst of crossing time and huge events. How hard is it for you to marry those two?
The big events are made out of little granular events. Let me try and do a legal answer on that. Storytelling involves big gestures. It involves a kind of willingness to generalize, to simplify the world into kind of one smooth curve that makes a kind of temporary sense of things in order to be intelligible. So storytelling is constantly trying to fold events into big events, and storytelling always wants to up the ante as well. It has a kind of built-in tendency towards the spectacular. Give a story a house cat and it goes, why not a tiger? But against that, there is our need to recognize our own kind of wavering faces in the watery surfaces of the stories we're telling, which means that we have to check the built-in tendency to do the big and grand and sweeping and exceptional and extraordinary, and make sure that there's space for the way that most lives aren't just small. Most lives contain a complete set of scales in them, in which mostly it's it's titchy, and every now and again something middle-sized happens, and once in a blue moon you're part of something large. But you can't be faithful to that if you select out only the big and eye-catching. You really need to go and you know, buy a network card, or do the washing up, or go to work, and all of those things. And I want to tell the kind of stories which still work like stories, but which kind of hoover up the minutiae and find the human sense in them.
Yeah, readers need warming up, don't they, as well?
They do.
Yeah.
And I am a strong believer in pleasure, and in reading being pleasurable, so long as you allow pleasure to come in umpteen different flavors. So I kind of want people to be recompensed for paying attention to washing up. If I say, look closely, we're going to be doing washing up now, I want people to think that they're going to get something pleasurable in return, whether it's the kind of the quiet comedy of too much fairy liquid, or some piece of character disclosure, or something. But you know, people deserve prizes for paying attention, I think.
Yeah, and I wonder whether you've because obviously when you were writing the book, there wasn't a pandemic or an anticipation of a pandemic, unless you're fortune teller. And so I wonder whether your kind of sense of your, you know, general reader changed as you now imagine the book coming out into now.
Yeah. It was already happening when the book was going through the works at my publisher. I mean, I knew that I was writing about lost worlds, not one but several layered lost worlds coming, you know, in recent time, but already in, you know, different worlds of kind of manners and different worlds of attitudes. But what I hadn't expected was that I was using a whole sort of basic city vocabulary of events, which would all suddenly become a lost world. So my editor read it when I first delivered it, and talked about the scene where Alec sees all those people on the tube and sees a separate soul looking out of every pair of eyes, and he just went, going on the tube, eh? Those were the days. And I thought, yes, I've just assumed that there's that kind of vocabulary of city activity there, and it's all suspended. So it's going to be weirder and remoter than I meant it to be.
Yeah, I wonder whether it encourages a level of kind of attention or reassurance, both in kind of seeing the everyday rendered as extraordinary, as a kind of like, yeah, you know, my routine, like very contained life right now, has these kind of strange eccentricities and, you know, interest to it. Yeah, it's kind of reassuring.
Are you writing a pandemic novel?
No.
No, neither am I. But somebody is, and it'll be fascinating.
Yeah, it will be, although I won't be ready to read it until I've had at least
No, I want to be safely out of the pandemic before I holiday in the pandemic again.
Yeah, I think so. We've got some more questions. Erica asks, having written non-fiction for so long before turning your hand to fiction, did you find the transition easy, and do you find one form easier than the other?
I think I've sort of covered that a bit, but the difficult thing was giving myself permission to start, and it wasn't a sort of once off kind of now you can do it thing. I had to keep reassuring myself that it was really okay for me to make things up, because there is a deeply undignified element to fiction, which is basically like, as I've told my students, like kind of adult finger painting. You just kind of make a mess, and after a bit you show it to somebody. It feels liberating, and to that extent easier to be writing fiction. And I'm sorry I didn't dare earlier. But I don't regret any of the non-fiction I wrote, and I stand by having been interested for decades in how the documented world works, and the kind of literary sense you can make of you can make of that.
Mm.
And I'm not done with non-fiction either. I have at least one more novel to write, but there's a non-fiction idea forming somewhere in that kind of space above my left eyebrow, but slightly out of sight, kind of over there somewhere. And I shall be back to work on that at some point.
Amazing. Looking forward to that. Talking of non-fiction, Chris asks, did you think of linking the tragedy with the New Cross fire in 1981, which also happened on New Cross Road?
I did think of it, but I decided not to because that was one of the moments where I thought the question of appropriation, which I'm generally a bit skeptical about, actually did seem to mean something. That the New Cross fire is a landmark in kind of Black British history and in the evolution of Black London. And though that's part of the story of London I want to tell, it's kind of not mine, and there wasn't an angle into it that made sense with those characters. So I was aware of it as a background, and I'm afraid that my characters were more likely to see that stuff from inside a National Front march. Oops, not a Nazi.
It's going to be a record for the number of times in an online book event we've had to disclaim that the author's not a Nazi.
Yeah.
Andy wonders if you are writing in lockdown, and if so, how different it is.
I finished this novel just before lockdown happened, and to begin with was really pleased about that, because it felt as if it sort of, at least I'd finished the novel before the world went bizarre. But then I found I was going into lockdown without the kind of that one organizing thing that I always knew I ought to be doing at the front of my mind, and really missed it. And then found it very, very difficult to concentrate. I did a lot of frittering, particularly during the spring lockdown. And it took me ages to find my way back into writing, including a completely discarded idea for a novel, which it took me quite a long time to work out was not a good idea. So I can't answer the question, because I've hardly managed to write anything looked at in some ways, though I have now daydreamed my way successfully to the point where I have got another project. And since lockdown is not over, I expect to find out what it's like writing successfully in lockdown anytime soon.
Well, let me know.
Yeah.
And we also got a question from Alice. He says, do you base your characters on real life people?
No. And yes. No, in that they do not correspond to any existing historical or human originals. Yes, in that they have got bits in them of observations from real people I've made over years and decades, as well as bits of me in various configurations, as well as things I've noticed because other people have told me about them. I mean, that sort of sensitive, quivering network of human beings talking to each other brings messages from elsewhere, which are sometimes the ones you want. And you can find kind of, I'm not going to tell you how to, but you could find originals for a number of the things that happen in the book, but they have, I hope, all been kind of changed and remade by being made part of the kind of imagined wholeness of some other life.
Good question. Good answer. It's always a difficult one to be asked. I feel like
it's really easy to answer it with sort of glibly or with a joke, but it's actually quite difficult to answer it kind of straight.
Is, yeah, because it's such a complicated kind of patchwork, and also I don't think the writer even necessarily knows the full answer to it, of where things come from and you know what the roots are. We've got a question from Don. He says, what influenced your choice of time sequences in the book? So I guess the sense of, the 15-year and day.
Yeah. Well, not directly Michael Apted and the Up series. More, if I'm honest. I'm about to be joined by my cat. Yes. More, if I'm honest, a really excellent and underrated quartet of fantasy novels by an American writer called Daniel Abraham, called the Long Price books, which move at 15-year intervals through the life cycle of their characters, and it's very disconcerting and very striking when he does it. And I'm afraid I thought I'll have that. But repurposed quite a lot in terms of what I wanted to do with it. But I have, like I suspect many writers, I have form in gathering up things that have struck me and going, I'll have that. It's a legitimate part of the profession, you know.
Of course.
Of course.
Marion has got a kind of connected question in that she's asked you what you've read during lockdown. And whether what you've read has changed.
Oh, yes, in that the proportion of reliably pleasure-giving, take me somewhere elsewhere now, please, books have increased. Not all books I knew. Somebody recommended to me the extraordinarily kind of pleasing series of adult romances by Eva Ibbotson, the great children's writer, and Eva Ibbotson's series of 6 romances, which she described disparagingly as being written for old ladies or for people with flu. They certainly work for me. They are deeply pleasurable, beautifully wittily observed, kind of utterly unreal kind of narratives in which usually Austrian refugees with tremendously good hair kind of fall for forceful, slightly titled men, and then there are enormous misunderstandings and a lot of very good cookery for some reason, and it all and a lot of good jokes, and they all work out well in the end. And that kind of thing I've been reading more of proportionately while plague ravages the world for some reason. Otherwise, what I've been reading, I've been reading for my next book in a way that will make no sense at all if I say stuff about 16th century Jesuits, stuff about Native Americans, stuff about prohibition in the United States, stuff about the cotton business, and lots of stuff about jazz. But that's work, and I know why those things fit together. What else? I've just finally read the last Marilyn Robinson book, Jack, which is completely wonderful. I don't know. The trouble is that I'm always reading about 2 or 3 things. So people go, what books? And I go, and that was me.
You've got the opposite problem to me. Whenever someone asks me what I've read, I can't remember a single book, but you've just listed, every possible book.
Yeah, but with a sense that I can't really remember any of them as I do it. So yeah.
I think we've run out of time. Sadly,
it does seem to be 4 minutes to 8. No, 3 minutes to 8.
But thank you so much for being here in inverted commas, and for such an interesting and engaged conversation. It's been really fun. And also to everyone at home, thank you for watching and for the plethora of questions as well. And reminder as well, if you haven't got a copy of Perpetual, you can buy one via Hayes website, and I recommend it so much.
And you should also buy Rebecca's book.